I'm Jez Benton, and this is Route to the Top. I'll be meeting with a whole range of leaders who'll climb a mountain together and do a video podcast from the summit. In this episode, I'm on the top of Mount Tam, as it's known by locals, just outside of San Francisco in California, and I'm with Paul Lightfoot, who's General Manager of Patagonia Provisions. So, it's called Route to the Top. I usually start with what has your route to the top been? I did a little bit of research on you before this and was very surprised to see that you were a lawyer. Briefly?
Yeah.
3 years?
No, much less.
Much less.
About a year and a half.
About a year and a half. So from lawyer to Patagonia Provisions, talk to me about that journey, that story.
Like all stories, it's a personal one, right? So I went to law school in New York City with the intention of becoming a public interest lawyer, but I'm competitive. And I got swept up in the competitiveness to get these coveted jobs at these white shoe Wall Street law firms. And I got one. They must have made a mistake. And people hated these places. I had a great experience. I learned a ton. My boss, who was famous for sort of driving an associate out every year because of how difficult she was, gave me a lot of empowerment. And I just learned a ton. I had a great experience. But my father was at the end of a very long period of dying, like in a bedridden, painful way. And my mother, this is in California, said, this is the time to decide how you want to handle your dad dying. Like, you don't want to not be there the right way, not for his sake. He's not really going to know, but for your sake. And upon reflection, I just could tell my job was all consuming. I couldn't disengage partly, so I quit. The law firm was very gracious. They gave me a leave of absence, which I'm sure I could still return to.
Right.
And went out to California in the spring of 1998 to be with my family while my dad died, which was the right call. And that was when the internet boom was booming, and I could just sense that it was the right time in my life to take a risk. All I had was a bike, not even a valuable bike, like it was a shitty bike.
Right.
And so there was nothing to lose. And so I came up with an idea. I worked in restaurants from 16 years old all through college, really. And I came up with an idea that was very similar to Open Table, a business called Food Line that built customer reservation management software for restaurants. And just without having any idea of anything.
I was going to say, that had no relation whatsoever to law, right?
Being a corporate lawyer, which was all Wall Street stuff, it was nothing. I didn't learn much that was useful except for transactions, which was fine. We were raising capital, but it's a starting point. So all I had was energy, and I had a shit ton of energy, and I woke up early and worked hard, and ended up raising a lot of money back then. In the late 90s, I raised about $13 million, which was a lot.
Yeah.
And I was a kid, and some of my investors were terrific, and we had an amazing time. My investors were the Ticketmaster City Search division of Barry Diller's internet company, American Express, and the Zagat survey. Remember those purple books?
Oh yeah, I remember the books very well from New York City. Yeah.
And it was fabulous. Grew to like 170 employees and 23 markets from like 14 employees in one market in 1 year. And when the NASDAQ crashed, we were out raising a Series C with Robertson Stevens. They did an amazingly bad job. they were stretched thin at the time, right? And NASDAQ crashed, and nobody got a Series C done. And
okay.
We were just so overextended in everything, leases, employees. There was nothing to do but wind it up. And so we wound it up.
And I've heard you talk about, on a couple of occasions, without going into too much detail, you've talked about failures.
No.
Was winding that up, was that the biggest failure in your career?
It was the only failure where I lost the money of my widowed mother and all my relatives, and just to give you a sense of how I was so young, it didn't occur to me that my identity was not the same as Food Line. I thought they were the same thing. My wife, who was then my girlfriend, she actually pointed it out to me, literally had to say, this business failing isn't the same as you failing. It had never occurred to me. Like,
you were the business.
Yeah, and it was very high profile. Like the Wall Street Journal covered my ascent, and in a nasty way, it covered my failure as well. And I lost a lot of people's money that I cared about. So it was a gut-wrenching, awful failure. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny when I did a round of fundraising for my current firm, I had I actually raised 300% of what I needed.
Congratulations.
100, yeah, I didn't take it. 100% from friends and family, which was about 10 different people.
Yeah.
100% from an investment company, and 100% from another investment company. And I sat there and I had that conversation with myself, because I see a lot of people celebrating raising a round of money, and I'm like, that doesn't feel right to me.
It's the fuel, not
like,
the journey.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, we raised,
Wow.
50 million for this or whatever.
Yeah.
I'd be like, oh my God, I now have a huge responsibility to those people for that money, which is what, so long story short, I didn't take the friends and family because for some reason I felt like that would be a different kind of pressure, and if things didn't work out, it would be a different kind of failure than it was if it was some other organization. I could maybe separate those two things. So I can empathize with that feeling of, I imagined what that would be like, but it must be really tough.
My first angel investor and board member at Food Lion, who lost every cent he invested, was also my first angel investor and board member at Bright Farms years later.
Nice. So and we come around to the success.
But I remember that he died sadly after my Series A in a plane crash.
Oh.
Brian Robertson. But he had sent me a fancy bottle of wine to open when the Series A closed during the beginning of Food Lion, because he was an investor before that. So he felt like when I got that done, he had succeeded as an angel investor. And I remember not feeling like celebrating when the money hit the bank.
Yeah.
I think I ordered a pizza and drank it with my sister who I was working with. And I just remember not understanding why I didn't feel, but it's because of what you just said. Like, oh, I better not screw this up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
And I did, and I screwed it up.
Well, you didn't screw Bright Farms up. So attorney, Food Line.
Yeah, so I was, I think I was probably the most depressed I'd ever been in my life during that period. And remember, my father hadn't died that long ago. He had died 2.5 years earlier, and I never paused. So it wasn't like I had a time to grieve. I was about to get married. My mother-in-law was dying. It was a tough time, and someone that had been watching me owned a small enterprise software company that he had bought, and it had gone bad in every way you can imagine, like negative gross profits. Like, it was amazing how shitty that business was. And he called me and said, I'd like you to come take over this business. And it was called AL Systems. And he basically said, you have 3 options. You can shut it down, you can sell it, or you can fix it. You cannot have any cash at all. Like, I am done propping up payrolls.
Yeah.
And we had great customers: Gymboree, Kohl's, Urban Outfitters, Mervyn's. We sold automation software systems that automated distribution centers of like mid-market apparel retailers. And man, it was so hard. It was a year to turn it around. And then I started growing it. And for about 7 years, I grew it strongly and profitably, but without raising any capital. And anyone who's been around long enough knows that growth consumes cash, right? Every bit of my cash was receipts from my AR from my customers. And it was a really wholesome experience. That's where I grew up as a business person. That was my 30s.
Yeah.
That's where I learned.
You have to make it work.
Yeah.
It's not like there's a big cash balance, and if you burn it, you burn it, and if you don't, you've got to.
Yeah. There wasn't some theory that was going to work in the future.
Yeah.
It was, my customers give me money for value this quarter, and I'm going to make next payroll because of it. And if I don't close this deal, payroll is not certain. And I did that for years.
Yeah.
It was hard and stressful, but very successful.
Yeah, nice. And then we went back. So that was software.
Yeah.
And then you went somehow back in, I guess, to food with Bright Farms. But Food Line, very different. That was, I guess, technology and software anyway, right? But that's another big pivot from. There
was no transition, right? And so what had happened was, near the end of my 30s, I had become increasingly focused personally on food that was good for the health of humans, food that was good for the environment, and thinking about the food that was the opposite of both, which was most of the food system in America. And I just started pining for a career in sort of the better for you food. And I really started thinking about local food as being the next organic. Like, I saw the organic trend 10 years earlier. Right. Like, literally in my mind, saw what would happen. It did happen. I wasn't part of it. And I thought, I'm not going to do the same thing with local. And so, no transition again. I literally made it up. And I brought home the idea to my wife. And she said, no. She's like, what are you talking about? You had a startup when you were in your 20s, when you didn't have any kids. You have 3 kids.
You know how this ended last time, honey.
And it failed, right? Well, she said you have 3 kids and a big mortgage now. Like, why would a startup be the right thing to do? But to her credit, she negotiated a little bit of a slower transition, but she gave me her consent and just made it up. Like I didn't have any background in food. Now, I did have a background in automating supply chains of retailers, so I could go to grocers like All Delhi's and Kroger, and I could speak to their language about the way their supply chains worked.
Yeah.
And although it wasn't very romantic to say it, at its heart, I was saying your salad supply chain is broken in very important ways, and I'm designing a better system that's going to get you salads that are fresher, that are going to bring you better sales, better profits. It'll be better for the environment and better for your attracting of the most attractive consumers. And
local.
Yeah, well, local was the part of that.
Yeah.
All these salads had 14-day shelf life, and with the stuff from Salinas, it was wasting half of that and being moved from the farm to the processing facility to the East Coast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then from Bright Farms, how many years were you running that?
About 11.
Yeah.
Well, so but the exit was much different in this case. So, like for example, there was an exit. So in this case, the eventual owner of the company is this terrific 125-year-old family-owned company in Atlanta called Cox Enterprises. When Cox led our Series D in early 2018, I think, they and we sort of understood that if things worked out, they would eventually want to own the company, which gave me a long time to think about, first of all, making things work out, thinking about the fact that I would have a future afterwards. And did I want to keep scaling the business with them? Did I want to do something else? And by that time, I was learning about regenerative agriculture and the role of the food system in combating the climate crisis, the environmental crisis. And I know I wanted to be in regenerative. And so I hired my successor. I went to my board in late 2018, explained that we should hire my successor, which is unusual that a founding CEO will do that. And we did that. Hired a guy named Steve Platt, who joined in August of 2019. Spent a year doing it, very careful.
Yeah.
And he turned out to be fabulous. Like, he's a super good friend right now. Very unusual that works out as well. He's a great guy, and it wasn't easy. We had to work, we had a coach, we had to work hard at getting along. Him managing my team in front of me wasn't that easy. But it gave me the chance during 2021 to reduce my time to half. And I started writing a newsletter about regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, that's right. I'm a subscriber, or was a subscriber.
Yeah, 52 straight weeks of it coming out on a Friday morning, which is like an amazing dog to feed. Like, it's got, if you're not almost done on Thursday morning, clear the decks.
Trust me. I met a guy. Met a guy a few weeks back called Jonathan Fields, who has a podcast, and he's done 723 podcasts in the last 10 years or something like that.
Jeez.
And I've done 7. But mine are a little bit different. Like, I can't sit in the studio. I've got to climb a mountain. I can't sit in the studio and film like 4 in a day. Hey, Sadie.
Yeah.
And film 4 in a day or record 4 in a day. It's a little bit different. So I'll be lucky. I won't be able to get 52 out in a year. Maybe 8 to 10 is my target.
And so doing that, and I don't think I'd be here, by the way, without that newsletter. And the newsletter was intentionally a bridge to where I wanted to go. And in fact, in September of 2021, I actually wrote a manifesto, and I published it.
You did.
I will spend the rest of my career building, food brand businesses with regenerative agricultural supply chains. And it's not exactly what I meant, but I am actually completely fulfilling that mission that I laid out for myself. And I learned about the opportunity in a fairly traditional way. A headhunter called me and said, "Do you know anybody who'd be interested in this opportunity?" And when they sent me a document that they'd written to describe the business and the role, it read very much like my newsletter did. Like, it felt like I could have written that document. And this is very odd. This is not what they tell you to do. But my first call with the recruiter, I sat down and wrote an essay the next morning and sent it to them. And sent them an essay about my vision for if I got the job. And every meeting I ever had with someone at Patagonia, I ended up by saying, "I'll take the job if you give it to me, and I'll move across the country and start life
I
over."
love you too. I do. I know. You're licking the salt off my chin. Is that what you're doing? Are you getting a sweat? They always say never film with dogs and animals, and this is exactly why.
I think this is part of the story, right?
Sadie. So that's what brought you to Patagonia. So for my audience, you talk about regenerative agriculture, regenerative farming. I just did my last podcast was with a farmer and viticulturist. I always get that word wrong. Who was an ecologist that then got into wine and is obviously regenerative farming from a wine manufacturing standpoint in Napa Valley. But for my audience, can you sort of idiot's guide to regenerative farming? What do you mean by it?
Yeah, so it doesn't have to be farming, right? Because there could be things in the sea as well, right? Yeah. But generally, regenerative is a process of agriculture that is restoring ecology. Generally speaking, when it's terrestrial, when it's on land, it is building carbon matter in soil. So you're rebuilding soil. And the way you get there depends on the set and the setting, right? Depends on the types of crops, depends on the climate. But generally speaking, it's a series of practices that instead of using chemical inputs, using natural inputs like compost, cover cropping, not tilling, and growing the right things for the right place, that carbon is baked into the soil.
Yeah.
And of course that has a lot of benefits. The most obvious that gets the most talked about is that it actually removes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it in the ground. The ocean and the soil are the two greatest carbon sinks on Earth, and people are just starting to understand that on a mainstream basis. But it also stores water in the ground. It also holds the soil in the ground. You know, we're losing our topsoil in this country at a devastating rate. And it enables the great biodiversity that we require, and without which, you know, humanity can't survive. It's clear to me, I'll answer the question you didn't ask, which is that organic did not save us in America. You know, 1% of our farmland is organic. Even the 10% of our sales perhaps are organic. It's either being imported or it's just labeled.
It's just labeled that way, yeah.
Regenerative will be bigger and it'll be faster to get there than organic was. And if it doesn't, we're probably f***ed.
Yeah. Putting no finer point on it than that. So you know, what gave you the mission, the passion behind the mission of what you do? Where did that come from? Where did that spark? We were talking on the way up. You were talking about toilet roll and plastic and the battles that you have in the household about what we buy and what we don't buy. So where did that come from? Because it didn't come from you being a lawyer, and it probably didn't come from you, running a software business. Like, what's...
Well, I do remember running the software business, because if you zoomed out of the software business, you were making global supply chains of goods more efficient. And at 31, I really saw the virtue in that. Like, I imagined a single mom in the middle of the country being able to afford her clothing for her children, right? As I got to the end of my 30s, I started to question that model. Like, do we really need more cheap stuff from China? And eventually I concluded that we probably had too much stuff, right? So I can't explain where this comes from, this internal motivation that I have. But I can tell you how that feeling or that part of me got me to here, which is that it was obvious to me that climate change was going to be the defining challenge of this part of human history. And I knew that if I got up early and worked on it, I could feel great. And I knew that if I didn't work on it, I would feel a little bit of despair, right?
Yeah.
And that's the key.
Bystander.
Yeah, and the key to... I'm a really optimistic and quite cheerful person who's working on really awful problems that are not so far going well. And I think to myself clearly, how do I jive those two things? And the answer is, I get up early and I work with purpose. And it's not like it's going to be good or bad. It's a million scenarios in between. And if I can nudge us to better scenarios, well, that's a pretty good outcome, right?
Yeah.
It's like that one starfish. It mattered to that one.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned the word purpose, and I made a few notes before we came up just around Patagonia. Patagonia has a new mission as of, I guess, late last year, which is save our home planet.
Yeah.
Which is
to save our home planet. Very simple.
To save our home planet. Very simple. And Earth is now our only shareholder, which was a line from Yvonne when he was explaining the restructuring of the organization to say, well, we didn't want to do an IPO and raise a ton of money and put that money into good work, and we didn't want to carry on what we were doing before with a percentage of the money going into projects or whatever. So we wanted to flip that to say, okay, well, if the earth is our only shareholder, how do we structure an organization that's purposeful that way? So I don't need to ask you the question. I know why you were drawn. I can tell why you were drawn to that purpose and that mission, because it's what you've been building up to and been thinking about and doing previously. So now you're there. How does that feel?
So there's really a before and after that restructuring was announced in September, right? When I got to Patagonia in May of this year, so 7 months ago or so, it was amazing to be part of an organization where everybody was weird like me, right? So when I lived in Westchester County, New York, I was a weird guy in my zeal for environmentalism and my outdoor activities, my cycling. I lived in a community of finance people, right? And so I was a little bit of an outcast. That was fine. I didn't mind being. I sort of enjoyed the label of being a weird guy. But here, it's a beautiful thing to be surrounded by people who basically all came to Patagonia because they care.
Yeah.
Like, there's nobody that I've met, and I've met a lot of people. There's 3,600 employees. I haven't met them all, but I've met a lot of them. Everybody cares. So right from the beginning, I was like, oh, these are my people, and this is my place. And by the way, this is my place. Like, I'm in the mountains all the time. I'm hiking all the time. I'm cycling all the time. But when we announced that deal, everybody who works at Patagonia now understands that the fruits of their labor, if we're going to sell a $400 piece of equipment or apparel, there's a profit margin at the end of that. And everybody understands that profit margin will flow directly into a purpose trust whose only purpose is to fight the environmental crisis. And that's a sense of purpose that's extraordinary, right? Yeah. And I've never seen or heard of anything like that before. And it's galvanizing, and it's energizing, and it's awesome.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, we don't talk about to our customers. We're actually not allowed to market with that idea because we don't want it to be perceived as a gimmick.
As a marketing gimmick.
It's not a marketing gimmick. Yeah. And it's not for next year either. It's for we think about it as a 50-year thing.
Yes. Yeah. I read the little Yvonne put out a kind of Q&A, and it talks about the next 50 years. And
that was why, if there's a God, he'll let Yvonne live for as close to 50 years as possible. But odds are at 83, he might not make it to another 50 years. And so really the timing of this was thinking about having enough time to have a thoughtful transition, essentially, right? He was an excellent steward of the company as its owner for the last 50 years. His family is. And this is intending to put in place a structure that will outlast the family.
Yeah, yeah. Truly sustainable in that way, yeah. So you talked about the $400. Is that how much you paid for that? No.
I think it was $400.
I'm Patagonia. I have two brands in my outdoor life. Patagonia is one, and I won't name the other one because I'll save that for another podcast. But
I'm not carrying on if you can do another podcast with other brands.
All right, and then I'll take it back. I won't do it. So here's a quote from Von. He said, "People need a new jacket every 5 or 10 years, but they eat 3 times a day. If we really want to protect our planet, it starts with food." And that was one of his answers to somebody, I guess, questioning, hold on a second, why is Patagonia getting into food? So he's not here to pose that question to again, but you are. Why? That answers the question, I guess, why food, but what are you doing? How are you doing it? How's it working?
It's a joy, by the way, to think about that quote and the resulting work that we get to do coming from that, right? So if the mission of the company is to save our home planet, which it is, if you think about the apparel business, if we do a good job, which is hard, and we succeed, maybe we can get our emissions and our impact very close to zero for making apparel. But food, we talked about what regenerative means, right? If you're growing the right kind of food regeneratively, you're actually having a positive impact on the climate. You're removing carbon from the atmosphere and storing it in the soil. So food, at least theoretically at this point in our development and our history, could become the most powerful lever in our effort to fulfill our mission and our destiny, really, to save our home planet. And so if we're really serious about our mission, we thought, and this is before I got here, well, we got to be in food, because food is going to be the most powerful lever to fulfill our mission.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because when I first started seeing Patagonia Provisions, I didn't make that connection. The connection for me was, you go hiking, you need snacks when you hike, and a good beef jerky or buffalo jerky or some mackerel in a tin or whatever it might be. Is that so? You into REI or other stores and you see the provisions that you hold in, and so that was my connection. The connection wasn't actually, if we want to save the home planet, it's going to be through food, and we need to be in that, because I guess the other thing is Patagonia's never going to become the world's largest food business, but that's not its aim, right? Well, maybe you will, but it's how do we influence everybody that's in the food business to be thinking differently, So you have it's not just a responsibility to do that with your own food that you're selling, but how do we influence an entire country, world market to think differently?
Yeah, so Yvonne has said publicly, and he's told me privately, that the food business should rival the apparel business. So we do have pretty high ambitions, right? Like there's a lot of market share to be captured. Food is a pretty big market around the world, right? So yeah, we're going for it.
You're going for it. I love it. I absolutely love it. So let's double click. Oh, we've got a few people coming down the mountain with a guitar.
Hello.
Hey guys, how are you?
How you doing?
Yeah, all right. So let's talk about leadership. That's my world.
Yeah.
You're in the world of food. I'm in the world of leadership. How do you think about your own leadership, you personally? How do you think about, leading a revolution in regenerative agriculture? How do you feel about, leading a business within a business, which is the Patagonia Provisions? So leadership is a general thing, you and the organization.
Yeah, I'll start with the end. There was an open question about the transition for me to being on someone else's leadership team, because I had been a CEO reporting to a board for 20 years of 3 different companies. And that wasn't just a question for the guy who runs the parent company who I report to. It was a question my wife asked me, and I asked myself.
I was going to say, when you're asking yourself, I'm sure.
And it turns out it's fantastic. Like, I love being on that leadership team because I'm surrounded by people in different parts of the business that are all working toward the same purpose, right? So it's been a joy. Like, I love it. Like, this is a place that suits me and a culture that, I told Patagonia's CEO, the guy I report to, Ryan, that if I get driven out of the food business, I'm going to go full jackets in the San Francisco store. Like, he's not going to get me out of the company because I just like it too much, right? Now, back to the idea of leadership in general, I've always loved being a leader, right? And the definition of leading is getting someone to follow you, right? So in this case, I'm getting my colleagues to follow me charging up the hill in the revolution about changing the food system, and that just couldn't be any better for me, right? My style of leadership, which I've thought about for decades and have a really clear understanding of how I want to lead. It's empowerment. It's giving people all the information, giving people the authority to make decisions, being totally trusted and trusting. And, that's just been terrific and great, right? And we've got a lot of work to do. And frankly, I think it's the only way you can get it all done is that kind of a system.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. One of the reasons for doing Route to the Top is that you could be mistaken, if you read the press, that the world is just chock full of terrible leaders doing terrible things. Every page is the next thing that's blown up, or the next issue with this or that or that, whether it's political or big business or whatever it might be.
Right. Everybody's Enron or Elon Musk.
And it's like, and so the mission behind this is actually, no, the world is actually chocked full of people trying to do really good work, trying to lead people and lead organizations into the future. And it amazes me how many stories there are out there, but there's very little outlet for those successes to be told. And I think Patagonia is one of those bigger success stories as an organization. So there's no surprise that you found yourself there, I don't think.
And by the way, we're both members of YPO, so we both meet lots of leaders that aren't in the spotlight all the time. And that's when you realize that, like, most people are good people trying to do the right thing. It just happens to be that what bleeds leads in the media, right? Yeah. And so it's much more interesting to write about an asshole leader doing bad things. But of course, that's not what most of people are, right? No. Now, there's a continuum with the asshole leader on one side or Enron on one side and maybe Patagonia on the other side. But there's lots of stuff in between that's maybe a little, we're benevolent and in the spotlight a little bit because of where we are in this moment in time. But there's lots of stuff in between that's doing good stuff as well.
Yeah, and it's amazing. I'm starting to see themes now. I think this is probably the 8th or 9th route to the top that I filmed. And people have asked, so what's common across the people that you've interviewed? And I have everything from a guy who runs the World Gold Council to Netflix to Patagonia to, big dairy manufacturing, real broad range of organizations. And I'd say one of the themes that runs through for all of them is that they can identify within the organization a kind of deep-rooted purpose in the work.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to me because I was like, yeah, but does that just happen later in life for people? Or, they figured it out through a kind of journey of learning about what didn't work for them. But it's amazing. Even the guy at the World Gold Council who sits on a not-for-profit charity, which is a child abuse charity, because he was abused as a child. And his work at the Gold Council is about eradicating nefarious gold mining practices with child slaves in developing countries. Yeah. So he's like, I can take it right back to my childhood, to my purpose, and I can put my finger on it right there. And that's really common across all of the leaders that I've been speaking to.
I mean, when I began Bright Farms from my home in 2010, I started by writing out my values, right? Like my first employees saw it on the wall, because I knew already by that time that it had to be foundational, like the constitution of a country. And, purpose was baked into what, we were trying to grow food in a way that was better for the planet and better for our customers from the get-go, right? So I learned some of that by reading Yvonne Chouinard's book when I was younger, Let My People Go Surfing, but also just being a student of life and leadership. Jim Collins wrote a book called Beyond Entrepreneurship that you haven't read because no one has. I was the only person that read it.
But you were the one book that was sold.
I asked him. I met him at a conference one, and I said, "Why doesn't anyone else know this book?" And he was like, "Nobody wanted it." I thought it was great. I said, "Me too." He's like, "Oh, there's two of us." But it was great. It was a blueprint for how to develop your values.
Right.
And he wrote it while he was still at Stanford before he wrote Good to Great and Built to Last and all that.
Yeah. And I guess landing at somewhere like Patagonia, that stuff is so woven into the fabric of the place that people don't even think about it. It's just second nature.
Yeah, it's hard to even say it's woven into the fabric. It sort of is the fabric, right? Yeah. I mean, I chatted on a networking call this morning with a guy who was a chief sustainability officer at a big company and was thinking about what to do next. He was asking about Patagonia. I said, well, I'll tell you what, we don't have people like you. Like, we're all supposed to be doing that. Well, first of all, we don't use the word sustainability because we need to make it better. Making it equal for a long time isn't going to work. We've already ruined so much. But it's got to be the job of the sales guy and the product development guy and the CFO. Like, we're all in it for the sake of the purpose.
Yeah. So, question on learning. So, when I asked you the question about leadership, you talked about building trust with people, giving people autonomy to get stuff done, etc. Where did you learn that? Like, how did you figure out leadership?
Where did I figure out leadership? So I'm a really curious person, and I'm self-aware in a way where I judge myself a lot, right? And that sounds negative. But I'm just, I don't wake up and say, I've got the answers and I'm right all the time. And it just causes me to think about what works and what doesn't work, particularly what works in the way I'm doing my job, right? Like, remember that business I turned around in my 30s? We sold big projects. Like, we'd go to a client and say, give us 300 grand and we'll give you 180 grand a year in savings, right? Pretty easy to figure it out and model it. But you were killing whales. Like, the deals weren't happening very often.
Yeah.
And I remember looking once at our ratio of wins plus losses plus deads over wins or something, like our win ratio. I think it was 16%. And I was like, well, this is our problem. Like, our sales cycles are so expensive and big And so we spent 2 years meeting at 8 in the morning every Wednesday, learning a selling methodology that eventually you could see increased that ratio from 16 to 40% and propelled our business forward, right? And that's when I learned how to sell in a wholesome way, like selling by listening, persuading by using your ears instead of your mouth, right? Making sure that your sales calls delivered value to your customers. They wanted you to come in on your sales calls because they got value out of it. That's an example of just seeing that we weren't very effective and spending the time trying to figure out how to do it better. And if you ask me, when I left my last company, the leadership philosophies I developed were on the wall, like, alignment, transparency, accountability, and empowerment. And I actually can't tell you where exactly those came from, but I know that I cobbled them together over years and years of learning. And I probably, I'm not a guy who has all the answers I've made up, but I'm the one who figures them out and writes them down and, cobbles them together in a useful, effective way.
Yeah, and you've had enough experiences, to know what works and what doesn't work for you. So because you've seen it work, you've seen it fail, and you've patched that together.
It is true that I just have a lot of pattern recognition around. Like when I come across scenarios, I've often seen it before.
Yeah, yeah. No,
or at least I know who to call.
Yes. No, that's going to be your answer to my next question. Damn it. You may have
It's a segue.
Which is, so we talk a lot about, in our business, disorientating dilemmas, which we categorize as experiencing something that you've never experienced before. So you have no point of reference for it, right? So, I was just chatting again with the CEO of Trethefn when they had the earthquake, and it destroyed the buildings and ruined the winery and this and that. He'd never been through an earthquake before, right?
Yeah.
So where do you start? It's like I had no idea where to start. I basically started by telling everybody to get out of the building and standing in a circle in the parking lot, going, "What are we going to do now?" Right? So people find themselves having very transformative learning moments when they experience something for the first time, where they have nowhere in their mind to go into to say, oh, that's similar to that. I recognize that pattern. I know what to do. When was the last time that happened to you?
I think that happens all the time, actually, right? Like in small ways, right? I mean, I'm going to maybe, if I may, answer a little bit of a different question, which is, what do I do when that happens, right? And what I've learned, I guess, is that the creativity that people have is often most effective when it's inside of some sort of a framework, right? So if you see someone spinning, they're in a problem and they're spinning, and they're not, they're expending energy, but they're not making progress, right? I actually like to start by saying, we're going to define the problem first. Like, we're going to write down the problem, and everybody's going to agree on what the problem is. Because otherwise, we're going to have a set of, like, I'm right and you're wrong discussions, right?
Yeah.
And then we're going to talk about our options. And when you say to yourself, I have 3 options, then you can start judging the options. And then all of a sudden, and I could go back to the guy with the winery, right? Like, what is our problem? Our facility doesn't work. People are at risk. What are our options? And then you've got something real to wrestle with, right? It's just not, I'll just stop people and say, you need to stop. And you need to make sure you know what problem you're trying to solve, and you need to know what your options are. Maybe you need to ask 3 of the people to look at your recommendation for which option is best, right? So I think about those frameworks as being effective ways to get from here to there. I happen to be, and this is probably something that I've always had, a networker. Like, I am able to find people, like, I can't remember people's names, but if there's a problem next week, I remember that dude from 15 years ago. Like, I just know that was the guy who knows the answer, and we can call that guy. Yeah.
Or somebody who knows somebody.
Yeah. Well, and of course, that's the other thing. When you become 52, and you've been in YPO for 15 years, like, it is easy to find anyone, right?
Yeah.
Like, I can track people down.
Yeah. You can stalk them, put out a message. Yeah. Now, how about, because I guess with regenerative agriculture and the sort of leading edge of this work, there's probably times where you're problem solving what the problem is first, right? So it's not problem, we're deciding on what the problem is and then doing something about it. It's like, how do we problem solve the problem in the first place? Because you mentioned a couple of times, it's like, yeah, it's not about, we don't use the word sustainability because it's too late for sustainability. So the problem isn't sustainability. The problem is actually something else. How do you think about that?
Well, I think about this very clearly because I've had to think about this, right? And this is a business. Patagonia is a 50-year-old business. The food business is still in its nascency, right? So what I think about is if we can create market demand for regenerative agricultural farming, the farmers will show up, right?
Yeah.
We know that consumers will pay more for food that they perceive to be better for their health and better for the environment because they did that with organic. In the beginning, they paid 25 or 30% more. Now they're probably paying 12% more for organic food than conventional food. The gap has narrowed, which is a good thing. It turned out there's very little evidence that in America, eating organic food was better for our environment or for our health.
Yeah.
I'm sad. I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, my family eats entirely organic when we have the choice, which is most of the time. We don't eat at places where we don't have some say, generally speaking. But for consumers to be the lever to change everything, they have to have a signal, right? Organic provided that signal, even if it didn't really fulfill its ambition,
yeah.
right? Right now, there's a certification. So the Regenerative Organic Alliance is a nonprofit that I'm on the board of, that Patagonia helped set up, that certifies food as regenerative organic certified. That is a signal to consumers that it is grown in a way that's regenerative and that treats people fairly and is organic. We set it up with Dr. Bronner's and with the Rodale Institute, which helped set up the original organic standards. And I believe that and it's early days, right? It's only been in the market for a couple of years. But when consumers see that something is RO certified, they'll pay a fair price for it. And we'll be able to give more of that price back to the farmer. And that's what's creating market opportunities that will transition, that will convert farmland from either conventional or even organic to regenerative organic, which is, in our opinion, the key.
The key, yeah. Okay. Last question. Oh, maybe not. Maybe I have another one. You notice how the wind has settled down. It's kind of chilled now.
It's definitely chilled, and you can see that rainbow. Look at the rainbow.
A rainbow? Oh, yeah.
It's an extraordinary rainbow.
I hope that's on the camera.
So the light, and that's China Camp, like the light around here is unbelievable. No one told me how many times I would stop and say, the light is amazing.
Big sky. It's big sky. Yeah. So 7 or 8 months in, the restructuring of the organization is a 50-year process, thought, strategy, whatever you want to call it. What does the next 2 to 3 years look like for you and Patagonia Provisions?
So the team at Provisions did a great job before I got here. And they did what they're supposed to do, which is to create innovative, almost experimental supply chains, right? And I'll just give you one example. We began by giving grants to a nonprofit called the Land Institute to do research on creating a commercial version of a perennial grain called kernza. So most grains are annuals, right? You
Yep.
harvest them, you rip up the fields, the next year you seed, and that, generally speaking, especially when it's the way we do it in America in the Great Plains, releases a lot of carbon and destroys soil, right? Kernza stays in the ground for multiple years. It's a perennial, and its root system is way deeper than regular grains like wheat, right? But you can make flour from it, and you can use it in the same way that you use wheat, right? So right now we're making beer with kernza. We're making a beautiful fusilli pasta with kernza. But it started with us giving grants to a nonprofit and eventually creating markets for growers of kernza to make these foods. So my mandate now is to take this relatively short history, we're in our nascency, of experimental, innovative products and supply chains and making it commercially scalable and successful, right? So what you're gonna see is us having a very wide array of products, some of which don't seem to have strategic connections to one another. And you're gonna see it coalesce into families of products that will be able to be found together on shelves in grocery stores to achieve efficiencies in the way we're manufacturing, in the way that we're doing order fulfillment, working with the buyers at grocers and things like that. And you're just going to see the company really grow up, and you're going to see it scale to the point where you're going to get used to seeing Patagonia food at Whole Foods or even at Albertsons, like you're used to seeing Patagonia apparel when you go to REI.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, my friend.
My pleasure.
We
Thank
now
you.
have a chilly walk back down.